The year was 1864. The Civil War had already dragged on for 3 brutal years, carving up families, towns, and an entire nation. But on a rainy afternoon just 6 miles north of Richmond, Virginia, one man's fate would ripple through the Confederacy like a shockwave. His name was James Ewell Brown Stuart, J.E.B to his friends, the dashing Cavalier whose plumed hat and bold charges had become legend. For hours he had ridden the lines at a place called Yellow Tavern, rallying his outnumbered troopers against a Union cavalry raid that threatened the very heart of the South. Then, in a single heartbeat, everything changed. A lone pistol cracked. A .44 caliber ball slammed into Stuart's right side, ripping through his abdomen and tearing a path of destruction on its way out. He didn't cry out. He didn't fall. The general simply pressed a gloved hand to the wound, steadied himself in the saddle, and kept fighting. But inside, the damage had already begun. What followed was 27 hours of pure, unrelenting agony, the kind history books gloss over in a single sentence. They tell you Stuart was mortally wounded and died the next day. They don't tell you about the gut-shot nightmare that came after. They don't tell you how the man who once seemed invincible spent his final day fighting a battle no horse or saber could win. Born in 1833 on a Virginia farm, he graduated from West Point in 1854, a young lieutenant already known for his flair and fearlessness. When Virginia seceded, Stuart didn't hesitate. He joined the Confederacy and quickly proved himself Robert E. Lee's eyes and ears. In the Peninsula Campaign of 1862, he took 1,000 men and rode completely around George McClellan's massive Union army, scouting every position and stealing supplies while he was at it. Lee called him the finest cavalry officer he'd ever seen. The newspapers called him the Knight of the Golden Spurs. His troopers worshipped him. He wore a red beard, a yellow sash, and a black plume that fluttered like a battle flag. He sang hymns while riding into combat. He was 31 years old, married to Flora, father to young children, and he lived for the charge. By 1864, the war had changed. Ulysses S. Grant had taken command of all Union armies and was grinding Lee's forces down in the bloody Overland Campaign. At Spotsylvania Courthouse, the slaughter had been unimaginable. Now Grant's cavalry chief, Philip Sheridan, saw an opening. He proposed a bold raid, 10,000 Union horsemen armed with repeating carbines, slashing straight toward Richmond. The goal was simple: destroy Confederate supplies, tear up railroads, and, if possible, whip J.E.B Stuart once and for all. Sheridan bragged he could do it. Grant let him try. Stuart caught wind of the move almost immediately. With only about 5,000 tired troopers, he raced south to intercept. His men had been in the saddle for days, horses blown, rations short. Still, they pushed on through the night. On the morning of May 11th, they reached Yellow Tavern first, an abandoned inn at a dusty crossroads. Stuart positioned his brigades on a low ridge overlooking the road to Richmond. He knew the odds were bad, but he also knew what a defeat here could mean. Richmond itself was just hours away. The Confederate capital could not fall. The fighting started around noon. Rain fell in sheets. Union shells screamed overhead. Sheridan's men came on in waves, dismounted troopers advancing through the mud, Spencer carbines spitting fire. Stuart's artillery answered, but the Federals had more guns and better range. For hours, the two sides hammered each other. Stuart rode up and down the line, shouting encouragement, his voice cutting through the roar. "Steady, boys! Give them the cold steel!" His gray charger moved like it had done this 100 times before. At one point, he led a countercharge himself, pistol in hand, driving the enemy back down the slope. By late afternoon, the pressure was crushing. Custer's Michigan Brigade slammed into the Confederate left. The lines buckled. Stuart saw the danger and galloped forward to rally Company K of the 1st Virginia. He sat tall in the saddle, revolver barking, picking targets among the retreating bluecoats. Then it happened. A dismounted Union private, John Huff of the 5th Michigan, turned as he ran past. At 30 yards, he leveled his pistol and fired. The bullet struck Stuart just below the ribs on the right side. It tore through his intestines, severed blood vessels, and punched out near his spine. Major Henry McClellan, one of Stuart's staff officers, was close enough to hear the impact. Stuart reeled but stayed upright. One of his men called out, "General, are you hit?" Stuart's voice was calm. "Yes, I'm afraid I am." He didn't panic. He wheeled his horse and rode slowly toward the rear, still issuing orders. When troopers tried to help him dismount, he refused at first. He knew if he fell, the men would lose heart. Only when the pain became too much did he let them ease him down. Captain Gus Dorsey caught him as he slipped from the saddle. Stuart looked at him and said quietly, "Dorsey, save your men." They got him into an ambulance wagon. The ride back to Richmond was 6 hours of torture. The roads were rutted and muddy. Every jolt sent fresh waves of agony through his body. Dr. John Fontaine rode beside him and had to stop the wagon repeatedly so Stuart could catch his breath. At one point, the general looked up and told the doctor, "I don't know how this will turn out, but if it is God's will that I shall die, I am ready." He kept talking to the wounded troopers around him, urging them to hold the line even as he bled inside. They reached Richmond just before 11 that night. The ambulance stopped at the Gray Street home of Dr. Charles Brewer, Stuart's brother-in-law. 4 of the city's best surgeons were waiting, Brewer himself, along with Doctors Garnett, Gibson, and Fontaine. They carried Stuart upstairs to a second-floor bedroom. When they cut away his uniform and removed the gold sash he always wore, the truth was unmistakable. The wound was mortal. The bullet had done damage that no surgery of the time could repair. Internal bleeding had already begun. Peritonitis, the deadly infection that follows a torn gut, would follow. Stuart remained conscious and remarkably clear-headed at first. He asked for ice to press against the wound himself. The cold brought a few moments of relief, but the pain never really left. It came in waves that made him grit his teeth. Through the long night and into the next day, he lay there, listening to the distant rumble of skirmishing as Fitzhugh Lee tried to slow Sheridan's advance. Every few hours the doctors checked on him. His pulse grew weaker, his skin grew clammy, yet he insisted on handling his own affairs. He dictated messages to his staff, made sure his papers were in order, and asked repeatedly if his wife Flora had arrived. She was on her way from the countryside with their children, but the roads were flooded and bridges washed out. Visitors came and went, friends, officers, even President Jefferson Davis. Davis knelt by the bed and prayed. When he left, he told his wife Verena that Stuart looked so calm and strong it was hard to believe the end was near. But the doctors knew better. Mortification had set in. The stomach was dying from the inside. By midday on May 12th, the pain grew sharper. Stuart drifted in and out of delirium. In those fevered moments, he was back on the battlefield, issuing orders to couriers who weren't there. "Make haste," he'd mutter. Go back, and do your duty." Then he'd come around again, perfectly lucid, apologizing for the trouble he was causing. Late in the afternoon, the doctors told him plainly he would not live through the night. Stuart took the news without flinching. "I am resigned," he said, "if it be God's will, but I would like to see my wife, but God's will be done." He asked for Reverend Joshua Peterkin. Around 7 o'clock, the minister gathered everyone in the room, doctors, aides, household servants, and led them in prayer. Then, at Stuart's request, they sang his favorite hymn, "Rock of Ages." The general tried to join in, his voice a faint whisper, but weakness silenced him. When the last note faded, he looked at Dr. Brewer, who was holding his wrist and counting the fading pulse. "Doctor," Stuart said, "I suppose I am going fast now." Brewer nodded. Stuart's final words were steady. I am going fast now. I am resigned. God's will be done. At 7:38 p.m., 27 hours after that single pistol shot at Yellow Tavern, J.E.B. Stuart slipped away. The room fell silent. Outside, a soft rain continued to fall on the streets of Richmond. Flora Stuart reached the house 4 hours later, drenched and exhausted, only to learn she was too late. She would wear black for the rest of her life. Robert E. Lee was at Spotsylvania when the telegram arrived. He read it, then sat motionless for a long moment. Finally, he told his staff, "Gentlemen, we have very bad news. General Stuart has been mortally wounded." Later, he added in a voice thick with emotion, "I can scarcely think of him without weeping." The Army of Northern Virginia had lost more than a general. It had lost its eyes, its spirit, its most colorful symbol of defiance. The man who had once circled entire Union armies was gone, cut down by a single lucky shot in a fight that barely made the headlines back home. They buried Stuart 2 days later in Hollywood Cemetery, not far from where he fell. Thousands lined the streets of Richmond as the cortege passed. The Confederacy would fight on for another year, but something irreplaceable had died with him. The flamboyant cavalier who sang hymns and charged with a smile had faced his final enemy with the same quiet courage he showed on every battlefield. He met death the way he met life, resigned, faithful, and unafraid. That is the story the history books never quite tell in full. They give you the dates and the battles. They skip the 27 hours of ice on a burning wound, the delirium of old commands, the calm acceptance in a second-floor bedroom while the Capitol waited outside. They skip the gut-shot reality of what it really cost to be the South's most famous cavalryman. Jeb Stuart's war ended not with a glorious charge, but with a slow, brutal unraveling in a quiet Richmond room. And in those final hours, the Cavalier proved once more that bravery isn't only found on horseback with a saber raised. Sometimes it's found lying still, pressing ice to your own side, and whispering that you are resigned to whatever comes next.